Hey, it's Michael here from the Red Line. We're doing a bit of a special episode today. We're just chatting about the response to COVID-19 in Central Asia. Joined by two fantastic guests today. We're joined by Chris Schwartz, who was on our fantastic Kyrgyzstan episode, and Stephen Lioy, who's in Kyrgyzstan at the moment. So let's kick it off and start. So, Stephen, where are you at the moment?
Well, as you said, I'm in Kyrgyzstan. I'm about 500 meters from Bishkek's airport at the site of the old U.S. military transit center and am in quarantine because I flew in from Germany via Turkey, and was in what Kyrgyzstan considers Category 1 at risk for coronavirus infection.
And what's the base like there? Is it, dilapidated? Is it in nice condition?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you would expect for something that's been essentially abandoned since 2014, it's fairly dilapidated. It seems like they spruced things up a little bit in terms of reconnecting running water and electricity and things like this before they put people in here. But conditions are fairly run down. It's a little bit dirty. I'm terrified to turn on the air conditioner in the room because I don't know what's going to fly out of it if I do. It's not ideal. I mean, I've said on my social media channels, like, I spent a long time as a backpacker in China and Southeast Asia and India and whatever, so I've certainly stayed in worse places, but I don't think I ever stayed in worse for 2 weeks at a stretch.
Wow. Is there much there left from when it was a US base?
Yeah, so all of the sort of infrastructure is still here, right? All of the buildings, all of the we're staying in the barracks the soldiers appeared to have been using. A lot of the tents and the bar and the kebab stands that were set up for soldiers are still in place. It's just all sort of boarded up and locked up and inaccessible. And then there's a good several layers of razor wire around everything too.
And is there staff there facilitating the place, or is the list you just empty shelves?
So there's not like permanent staff at each building. I think wisely the staff are trying to stay as far away from us as they reasonably can because of why we're here. But there are soldiers, I don't know which branch they are, but there's people in military uniforms anyway, that are acting as sort of a like border perimeter, I guess you would say, around the quarantine zone. And then there are doctors that come by once or twice a day to take our temperature, and then some sort of like cleaning staff that come through once a day to disinfect everything, to take out the trash, there's other people that bring in food 3 times a day, all this. So there are some people around, but we're not interacting with them very directly most of the time throughout the day.
And have you got symptoms, or are you just in quarantine for safety?
No, thank goodness, man. So far, I'm fine. They've taken our temperature every day. Mine has actually been a little low. It's been 35 point something most days. No cough, no anything that I can tell. So I, knock on wood, as far as I can tell so far, am fine. But of course, part of the concern is that there's all these people that are in here and, sharing a shower block and sharing a latrine. And so the worry more than anything is that at some point somebody catches it in here from somebody else. And in fact, yesterday, 2 days ago, I don't remember for sure now, it's been long days. But in the past few days anyway, somebody was actually taken out because they had tested positive, and then they were taken to a hospital to be, I guess, quarantined separately in the hospital.
Wow. And what nationalities are there at the moment? Is it mostly Americans, or who's there?
No, it's overwhelmingly Kyrgyz. There are a few Russian nationals that I've seen. There's one other American that I've met, and I think other than that, it's all Kyrgyz people that I've interacted with.
Wow. And so, what are you eating there? What's the food like?
Man, if you ever stayed at a sanatoria in Issyk, it's basically exactly the same. There's kasha for breakfast every day. There's some kind of meat dish with a base and a salad for lunch and dinner every day. Usually a slice of bread and a tea bag served with it. So the food is not terrible. The conditions are not overwhelmingly terrible. Most of it is both the frustration of having to stay here, especially as the rules change and we're sort of left behind, and then also the somewhat unsanitary conditions that leave us, wondering if we're going to get sick because we're here.
Mm. So is anyone showing any symptoms, or is it all just kind of everyone's getting along and it's mostly just for safety kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there was one guy that was taken away expressly because he had corona. He tested positive. Last night around 11:30, I was out shooting some night photography and saw one dude wheeling his suitcase to the front to the headquarters. So sort of in a righteous rage, I followed him to see what was going on. And it turns out that he was sick with something that wasn't corona. And so they were taking him to a hospital. But the average people, like in the building that I'm in, I would guess that there's 20 to 30 people between the 2 floors. It's segregated by gender. So men are on the second floor and women on the first. from anybody that I've seen here, nobody appears to be even coughing or sniffling. There's there's a couple of smokers that have what seems to be a smoker's cough, but in terms of really seeming to show symptoms, no.
So you think they're being a bit too harsh, or do you think this is probably a good measure going forward?
Say it again.
Do you think they're being too harsh in their quarantine, or this is a good measure going forward?
No, I tell you what, man. I think it's a great idea, because this country is not equipped for the medical system to handle a pandemic. And so the fact that they're quarantining people, I think, is wise. But the rules have been changing every day that I've been here for who's sent to quarantine when they arrive. So when I came, it was people from a list of 2 different countries. And so if you came in from category 1 or had been in category 1 within 30 days, you were mandatorily sent to quarantine. But then that changed the next day so that anybody that flew in that didn't show any symptoms was sent home to home quarantine, no matter where they had flown from. And then it changed the next day so that anybody that had flown in for sure was going to be a mandatory 3-day quarantine and then go home. And so it's just sort of maddening that, the rules keep changing. And because I flew in on the 19th, the rules from the 19th apply to me and continue to apply to me. Whereas somebody that flew in on the 20th, in my same circumstances, would have gone straight home.
Wow. So what about Chris? Let's go over to you. So you're sitting in Bishkek at the moment. What's the vibe there? And is it a full lockdown yet?
The vibe is a bit tense. You like everywhere else in the world, you have a mix of people who underreact and overreact. And then you have everybody sort of in the middle, right? Ranging. So like my wife and I were semi-isolating, let's say, prior to the 18th when they announced their first 3 official cases. Because Kyrgyzstan was unusual by that point. There was 0 reported cases. We were one of the last ones to have no cases. And she and I thought that can't possibly be true. Look everywhere else around you, right? I mean, it's obviously sweeping through the world. So we were already taking precautions well before they announced it. But then you had people who there literally was at one point this video going around, kind of set up like a Mortal Kombat video where the coronavirus is going and fighting and beating up different countries. And then they come to Kyrgyzstan and it's like some street hoodlum from Kyrgyzstan chases the coronavirus away. So you had like that segment of the population who were like that Kyrgyzstan somehow had miraculously beaten the virus. And then you had the other population, even more paranoid than my wife and I, who were like already preparing for the apocalypse. And something like that sort of persists now. We're now in a kind of almost full lockdown. Legally, we're in what's called an emergency situation and not an emergency state. There's been some confusion as to what it is. An emergency state, as I understand it, is for all intents and purposes martial law. Martial law without being martial law. And as I understand Kyrgyzstan's history, it has had that emergency state several times in its history. First, when it was part of the Soviet Union, there were many incidences. And then subsequently, it's had emergency states, but only for like specific urban areas during political upheavals, because Kyrgyzstan's had a bit of a tumultuous political history. There is this lower status emergency situation, which is where we are now, which is kind of a catch-all concept whereby the government sort of accrues to itself more rights to sort of dictate to people how they should live without a full-blown, we're going to take away your internet. We're going to not let you go out at all. We're not going to, etc. So we do have restrictions on movement. We do have shops are closed, cafes going to deliver, etc. So in many respects, we resemble now what you would find in the majority of countries around the world. We're like almost at the deepest level of what is now the global standard for a national quarantine. It can go deeper, of course. I mean, Italy has announced even harsher restrictions on movement. We're not at that point yet. We can go outside still, as long as we don't go, more than 2 people, as long as we keep some distance between each other. We can go in the open air. We don't have to wear a mask necessarily. Neighboring Uzbekistan has required people to walk on masks everywhere. So we're kind of at that state. What happened though was that we got to the state very rapidly compared to other countries. So once we had official cases on Wednesday, the 18th, by Sunday we were at this stage. So that's one thing that makes Kyrgyzstan stand out a bit, is that once they had an official cases, they came out of the gate swinging. They decided they were not going to play ball. They were just going to go all the way with this, essentially, very rapidly. And that's because of the fact that they had somehow had 0 reported cases for so long, they had a chance to sort of observe what everyone else was doing around them and sort of at least learn some things not to do, which, as you're now seeing in Britain or United States, or if I may, Australia, a very slow, almost lethargic reaction to the situation. Kyrgyzstan decided, no, screw that. We're just going to go straight all the way to emergency situation, basically, which has caused people to be very discombobulated. People are still wrapping their heads around. I mean, even for me, in February, when we began issuing border restrictions with China and just thermal testing everybody who came into the country, I already canceled my plans to travel to the United States in May, thinking to myself that we were going to have something like other countries are going to have. I thought it wouldn't come so swiftly. So even my head was spinning. Yesterday, I was looking at my window and I was like, where are the children? No one's outside playing. Like, my neighborhood is insanely quiet. When literally just 2-3 nights before, people were having a barbecue. And they were like, oh, coronavirus, so, what is this, this conspiracy from our overlords or whatever. So I think you have a lot of that going on in Bishkek right now. People are just trying to emotionally come around to the new regime because it came so fast once it happened here.
So one thing a lot of Western countries are doing at the moment is there's no toilet paper on the shelves and people are panic buying. Is that also happening in Bishkek at the moment?
No. So Foreign Policy magazine and a few other magazines have sort of portrayed Kyrgyzstan as like a mad descent into apocalypse, and that has not happened. That has not happened. We have had problems for sure. In Osh, our southern city, there was I wouldn't call it a riot, but there was a situation where a lot of women trying to buy flour from a state vendor, getting flour at the cheapest price, had a bit of a clash with cops. What actually happened is the cops sort of made a human chain and physically pushed them back. And you see women hitting them in the heads and such, but it wasn't anything near a riot. And you've seen things like that in the south. And in the more lower class parts of Bishkek, there have been incidents like that where the police have sort of had to get a little tough to maintain order. But otherwise, it's been fine. If you were to go to your average supermarket here, you would find that some aisles get hit hard. Toilet paper is one, canned food is one, potatoes is one. Actually, why should I be surprised? Potatoes makes a lot of sense. Why it would be hit hard, and other shelves will be fine. But we haven't had panic buying. And now that we're actually in the emergency situation, it's almost kind of too late to do panic buying. Where you do have tension, I must say, among consumers, let's put it that way, is Kyrgyzstan is very dependent upon its neighbors for trade. And with the borders shut, we are still receiving cargo. But there's a lot of discomfort and anxiety about, okay, well, right now everything is stocked up, and we know the government has bought, stockpiles of essentials. But in theory, Kyrgyzstan could be at some point hitting some kind of food crisis. People talk about that. I personally don't know how realistic or not that would be. We'd have to be like several months into this situation for that to happen, I think. But at the moment, people are sort of keeping more or less calm.
Well, man, but in all honesty, to look at it from my family's perspective, that's what worries me the most, is that by the time that I get out of here, they're going to have stocked up on whatever they can find, right? But what if this does drag on for 2 months or more? Kyrgyzstan is at the end of global supply chains, essentially. And so where are more consumer goods going to come from if other countries are largely shut down and not making them? And then Kyrgyzstan is at the end of the line for receiving them.
But that's not a problem that Kyrgyzstan will face alone. Far from it. Yes, Kyrgyzstan's in the supply chains, and it's more vulnerable in many respects. It's a more fragile society in many respects. But if the world is 3 months into an ever-deepening quarantine, we have a much worse problem than supply chains. I mean, we're facing global economic collapse and societal collapse. We're facing like the need for martial law in societies, and even then, that martial law probably would not be effective. Which is why many epidemiologists and public policy specialists are talking about what they call the hammer and the dance. That realistically speaking, that's not going to happen, because in a sense, the coronavirus doesn't create enough incentive, so to speak, to drive societies to do that. right? The coronavirus is not an apocalyptic virus per se, such that unfortunately we could live with large-scale casualties and still kind of persist with life until we get to a vaccine, versus a kind of more Hollywood, let's say, style scenario where we have some viruses just laying waste to society, and yes, we just have to quarantine indefinitely and just get spiraling out of control. We're not faced with that scenario. So I for one, don't think we will go past maybe a month and a half, maximum 2 months of the emergency situation, because this government simply could not sustain itself at that point.
Mm. So, and something I find really interesting in Australia right now, one of the things people are panic buying is beer, of all things, except Corona beer. You can go to any bottle shop. The shelf is empty except for Corona beer, which is always boggled my mind. So let's talk about Central Asia. Yeah.
Well, here people have been buying up on vodka, not because they're drunkards. That's kind of partially why, but also because they want to use it to disinfect.
Makes sense.
But the thing is, vodka is actually not strong enough. It's only 40%. You need 60% or more.
Oh, I don't know. Kalashnikov vodka definitely hurts after enough of it. So let's talk about Central Asia as a whole. So right now, Turkmenistan is reporting that it has no cases. So is Tajikistan. Is that just because they don't report it, or is that because they actually have no cases? I'll let Stephen take this one.
Stephen, you want to take it, or should I?
Chris, I think I have an opinion on that, but I think you're probably more academically qualified to answer.
Okay, well, the academic answer to this is Turkmenistan is bullshitting. And the academic answer about Tajikistan is that they're also bullshitting. So Turkmenistan ideologically has to deny any problems. They pose themselves to their own people as a utopia. Even as they've been, for the audience, Turkmenistan is essentially, try to imagine North Korea without militarization, right? So it's one of the totalitarian states that Orwell never thought could actually happen. And it's been having an economic crisis for the last 3 years, a grinding economic crisis, to the point that the government, which used to subsidize almost every facet of life, has pulled back those subsidies, but then claims it's pulling back those subsidies not because they're having an economic crisis, not because like people are not being able to eat in the streets of many towns, but because they've been such an economic success. Why should we subsidize anymore? Let the free market now do it for us. So like they're masters of spin and bullshit. But that's because, as I mentioned before, they need to present themselves as a utopia. So they cannot admit that they have any problem, because if you do, the legitimacy of the state falls apart. Tajikistan, how to explain Tajikistan? Well, Tajikistan is a real, it's a frankly speaking, a real mafia state, a true blue mafia state. They don't go as far as Turkmenistan to deny problems per se. I just think it's a mix of like machismo, incompetence, and like, let's not freak out people just yet. I could not even begin to explain it. It's a disaster. I don't see what the logic is of that place. So I mean, a lot of it has to do with that its leadership is basically turning senile and insane, but it has, controls vast amounts of illicit wealth and patronage networks. So even the less whack jobby members of that administration don't dare to come out and sort of say, yeah, we got the coronavirus here, because who doesn't? Who doesn't have coronavirus? So this goes to a question that was sort of raised by Foreign Policy magazine about whether or not Central Asia was covering up and continues to cover up its cases. So Kazakhstan announced its first case, and then that sort of trebled and quadrupled about approximately a week before Kyrgyzstan did, and Uzbekistan also around the same time. And Kyrgyzstan, obviously, as I said before, many of us thought there had to be cases here. So what gives, right? Was it a matter of testing, or did they know? Now, Kyrgyzstan is interesting because we know that Kyrgyzstan didn't know. Kyrgyzstan knew about a week before they announced that 3 individuals had entered the country via flight from Dubai, and that they tested positive. What they were doing, though, was trying to track down all the members of the flight to test them before going public with it. That doesn't really sound like a cover-up to me. That sounds like due diligence. I can't speak for Kazakhstan. I know another Western journalist there who says the same thing as me, though, that Kazakhstan was just basically trying to get a grip on the situation before going public. Today, we plateaued at 14 cases 2 days ago, and today, literally 2 hours ago, they announced another 2 cases. So I think what Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan are going to do is, rather than just inundate people with the numbers, they just sort of wait until they have a cluster of, yes, we confirm, and now here it is, rather than just like the avalanche of statistics that you see in Western countries. Wait, I think I'm losing the thread. It's 19
That's right.
years.
So I'll put this one to Stephen. So the other country that was reporting very little cases, only just a handful, is Russia, even though they're building lots of hospitals. Do you think Russia actually has a little amount of cases, or that it's lying about its numbers as well?
You know, man, it's sort of the same thing, right? Like, given the amount of travel that Russians do, given the number of travelers that pass through Russia's major airports, it seems almost unbelievable that it could conceivably be the case that there are so few. So I find it really, really unlikely, personally, that that's a real number, because instead there's just, it's so, information is still so contained there as well as it is in many of the Central Asian states. And so it wouldn't be a stretch at all to conceive that they were doing the same thing and trying to push down the numbers to prevent panic.
And staying on the Russia, let's talk about the big one that's all over, I don't know if it's over there in Kyrgyzstan yet, but it's all over Australia at the moment. The Chinese biological weapon theory. The theory that, that coronavirus is a Chinese biological weapon. I don't personally believe it. I think this is probably too sophisticated for a biological weapon, but let's get both your thoughts. Let's start with you, Stephen. What's your thoughts on it? Complete conspiracy or true?
Complete conspiracy. Absolutely absurd. Even if it was the case, what the theory that I've seen is that it escaped from a lab and somehow it infected Wuhan and then it spread from there. You know, it's just such a... The Chinese military, the Chinese government is strong and very tightly controlled, and the Chinese military really is quite orderly in the limited experience that I've had with them. So to think that it accidentally snuck out of a lab and hit Wuhan in an animal market, I don't know, it just seems absolutely absurd, not even worth considering.
What about you, Chris? What's your thoughts on it?
I'll put it this way. The Chinese government is definitely responsible for punishing that doctor who tried to blow the whistle. And they are definitely responsible for, in general, not treating the crisis seriously enough in time. But they're not responsible for this for this virus jumping from an animal to human being. Okay, maybe they could also clean up the animal market it came from, regulate the animal markets more so they don't turn into these kind of cesspools that they've become. But it's strange credulity that this is some kind of run-amok bioweapon. This is, again, another Hollywood-style scenario. I'm not a virologist, but my understanding is that the handful of successful viral-based bioweapons that have been created over the centuries kind of have fingerprints, so to speak, that there's something wrong with them. They don't look like a normal virus, let's say. And so the actual virologists who looked at this are saying, no, it's not a bioweapon. It's just one hell of a virus, basically, right? That successfully made the leap.
But on the opposite hand, I was here till, say, mid to end February, and I had someone very genuinely and wholeheartedly tell me that they had heard that in China, no Chinese Muslims were being infected, and so the government of China was actively encouraging all of its citizens to convert to Islam because Muslims were impervious to the virus. So this is just to give you an idea of the sort of just crap that's out there, right? And so I think it's sort of along the same lines.
Yeah, I sat in a policy meeting not long ago and had a message come through to the office saying, if I gargle with bleach, will that solve coronavirus? There's so many.
That's great.
I think it will solve your life problems if you gargle with bleach.
So the crazy bit about this whole virus is the fact that it's gone worldwide. And obviously both of you are from the States. I want to talk about what it feels like watching your home countries go through this while sitting on the other side of the world. So let's start with Stephen. You're from Louisiana, if memory serves. What's it like watching Louisiana? What's it like watching Louisiana go through this while you're up there?
So I grew up in Louisiana, but all my family live now in Texas, and so that's really what I've been focusing on. To be honest, man, in some ways I feel like the Kyrgyz government has done a much better job than even the American government or the Texan government. You know, until even just a few days ago, family were writing me, telling me they were going to yoga and going to pick up some coffee from the store and, you know, just living their lives very normally. And so maybe that's a populist thing and not a government thing, but still, it seems like the Americans just until the last day or two haven't been taking it seriously at all. And I think within a couple of weeks, you're going to see the error of that. And so it's sort of surreal. And, you know, before I got here, actually, I was sitting in Istanbul, was there for a week, and sort of had like east and west, right? I could either fly home and be with my parents and that family in the States, or fly to Kyrgyzstan with my wife and be here. And that honestly was a big part of my decision-making process, is I just thought to myself that I didn't think that I wanted to be in the States as this all went down, based on government response and the quality of healthcare, the cost of healthcare, for God's sake. And so that actually, I ended up coming back to Kyrgyzstan in part because of the way that it's being handled in the US.
I don't blame you. What about you, Chris? You're a Yonkers boy from New York. How are you watching the New York response to the climate?
So I completely agree with Stephen. In New York State, where I'm from, Westchester County is the epicenter for the coronavirus. New Rochelle in particular, I'm essentially like a 20-minute drive away where I grew up. My parents are still there. A lot of my childhood friends are still there. So what has been very impressive and reassuring has been to see how Kyrgyzstan's been trying to act very decisively about the situation versus, I don't even know how you can begin to describe the lethargic and shit show reaction of the United States. And it's weird because I talk to friends back there and they tell me, well, it looks like your choice to be in Kyrgyzstan wasn't so crazy after all. Because obviously from a Western perspective, it's unusual to live in this country. So yeah, but I guess it's also a bit of a gamble, because let's face the hard truth is that still the West ultimately, including the United States, for all its many problems in its healthcare system in particular, is wealthier, more organized. So in the long run, in terms of response capability, it's easy to imagine that sooner or later the West will have its act together, regardless of the human and economic toll. Whereas the outlook for Kyrgyzstan could be grim, because even though they actually were preparing for weeks, as it turns out, to eventually have an official case and declare and go to emergency situation, it's not clear what the preparations actually were. Some of them seem to have been dusted off old Soviet-era plans. And more to the point is that there's a bit of a silo mentality. There's not much cross-agency communication. So different agencies were like getting ready for this moment here in Kyrgyzstan, but they're not really collaborating. And I think you see this in Stephen's situation, where Ministry of Health, Ministry of Foreign Affairs don't seem to be like talking to each other, essentially, and sort of figuring out what is the most rational way of dealing with overlapping quarantine policies. Yeah, I mean, our families are here. When Stephen made his choice to come, we debated this. I actually was in favor of him staying put. I didn't realize, though, as he told me at the time, that Turkey is even worse than the United States in terms of its non-response. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't necessarily suggest it as a policy that people ought to try to get to their loved ones in a time of crisis, because it can make things worse. But it's definitely better to be with your loved ones, because you can consolidate your resources and plan better, even if you're in a country that's in a much weaker state like Kyrgyzstan.
So the biggest thing that's going to come from this, I think, this disease will be done within months, but the recession, or maybe even depression that comes from this, will take years, if not decades, to really get back on track. How bad do you think it's going to be, particularly, let's say, for America as well as the CIS? Let's see if you get this one first.
Man, I mean, I won't speak to the rest of the CIS as much as Kyrgyzstan because I don't know them as well. But Kyrgyzstan certainly is going to take a massive hit for trade. But also there is, in some sense, this sort of nomadic and agricultural tradition here, right? And so I do expect that it will be fairly grim here. But at least through the people that I know, the circle of acquaintances that I had, people still have relatives in the village. People still have relatives that live in the Jailo in the summer. Like, people have options of things they can do for at least basic subsistence. So I think that it will sort of get along, and if the economic hit really is that bad because they have to close for so long that the economic system just begins to fail, at the very least people have a place to go back to and a source for food. So I think it's less grim here, the prospects, than other parts of the world, but certainly will take some time to recover from once this is all over. I mean, even I work in tourism here, you know, and so many of my acquaintances are already terrified that there's going to be no tourists this year and they're going to have no income this year. And it's really a valid fear.
What about you, Chris? How bad do you think it's going to be?
Well, again, I am a bit of a skeptic in the sense of I don't think this will go on longer than 3 months as it is right now, that we'll go through a period of, while we're trying to get to a vaccine as a global community, we'll go through periods then of flare-ups, quarantines, openings. So we'll go through a very messy, like 18 months going forward. So for that reason, I don't think we're going to be faced with like per se economic collapse. Will we have a recession? I also don't think it will necessarily be as severe as 2008, because 2008 was driven by factors internal to the logic of that kind of capitalism that led to 2008. Whereas this is something external. It's a virus. It's something from nature imposing itself on us. So as soon as we have some kind of way of dealing with it, that pressure will be relieved or even gone. So I don't anticipate the recession per se globally to be that as severe as previously. That being said, certain sectors are going to be decimated. Tourism, as Leaven was saying. Kyrgyzstan doesn't have much of an aviation sector, but globally that'll take a big hit, which will impact people's ability to travel, which will impact cargo rates, which, et cetera, et cetera. There will be this knock-on effects. But Kyrgyzstan is like many of the former Soviet countries, is a more resilient society than average. They have a long tradition, unfortunately, of going through periods of deficit and even starvation. So it's in the cultural memory. There is some sense of how to deal with situations like this. The other thing that Kyrgyzstan has done that's been a bit different from other countries. So I'm very friendly with the business ombudsman here, the former British ambassador. So he and I have been talking about how Kyrgyzstan will try to deal with things economically. They don't have many resources at their disposal, but they're doing things like immediately relaxing loan repayment terms. They have representatives of the business sector in the Prime Minister's Emergency Cabinet Committee. So they have people immediately like talking about what the economy is going to need to survive. So they are at least taking some initial right steps to try to relieve the burden on the business sector, and thereby keep the damage from being great. They will not have the ability to sort of do what's being talked about in the United States, to sort of establish a temporary kind of basic income. They will not have the ability to just inject cash into industries like they're talking about in the United Kingdom. But they're not just going to like let the free market reign. They will try to do something at some point probably to intervene and keep things from going totally off kilter here.
So speaking of the United States, I think the biggest, it's an election year, and this is obviously the thing that will dominate world politics probably for the next 9 months once this thing all blows over. Do you think this will have an effect on the election? And who do you, with this wow factor of the coronavirus, who do you pick to likely win the 2020 election?
Man.
Let's see if this makes the cut. But yeah,
assuming Trump doesn't try to like declare a crisis and like move the election date, or like he's talked about having, was it him or one of his advisors talked about giving himself another year as president? I'm very nervous about predicting the American election. We'll put it this way. Trump clearly is out of his element when it comes to dealing with this virus. You watch his press conferences, you can see he's starting to kind of lose it psychologically, because you can't gaslight a virus, and you can't curse and call a virus nicknames. So he's clearly struggling with this. But if the world comes to some kind of new modus vivendi by the time of the election, he can go back to his old tricks again against whoever it will be, Sleepy Joe or crazy Sanders or whatever it's going to be. I think also if this virus had hit closer to the election, how to explain this? If this virus had hit closer to earlier in the primaries, we might not be talking about Biden as the front runner. We might be talking about Sanders instead as the front runner, because if Sanders wants to establish some kind of real universal healthcare system. So, I think right now the virus's chance to sort of have a legacy on the American election might have already been missed a bit in terms of the fact that Biden is almost certainly going to now be Democratic candidate, and he's not in favor of a radical change to our healthcare system. But who knows? I mean, who knows? I mean, it's very. I mean, what if there's a massive flare for the virus come election time, and we need to suspend? I don't know. I don't know.
What about you, Stephen? What's your prediction for it?
Well, man, the last polling data that I've seen shows still Trump's support for Trump's handling of this pandemic at something like 55%, which just boggles my mind from the outside. But if that is not enough to sink him with more than half of the country, then my God, what is, you know?
So the other one, obviously Central Asia is usually bundled together as almost region, but it's not quite. There's a lot of divisions in there that a lot of Westerns don't understand. Do you think this virus is going to bond Central Asia closer together as a big region itself, or increase ethnic tensions between, let's say, Kyrgyz and Uzbeks?
Do you want to take that first, Stephen, or you want me to do it?
Go ahead.
It's a really good question. I'm not sure how to answer it. We're already starting to see, maybe at the intergovernmental level, some of that bonding, and surprisingly between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. Did you see that news report earlier today that they're going to try to share medical resources or something like this? There was something they're going to share resources somehow. The two governments.
Interesting. No, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, and they're also going to try to coordinate some kind of cross-border response, apparently. Whereas Kazakhstan, which culturally, geographically, et cetera, in many respects is Kyrgyzstan's sort of big brother, tensions have been building between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan for a while. Not to the point of being a break. Michael, you and I talked about this earlier, but it's surprising how from the beginning, even the responses, when it was still seen as a primarily Chinese problem, the responses deviated, and how the Kyrgyz seem to be almost coordinating with the Chinese closer than with their neighbors in the north, the Kazakhs, for whatever reason. So at the intergovernment level, we're starting to see something, weirdly enough, between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, its real old rival. At the grassroots level, I don't know. I mean, a virus like this, a crisis like this, I think is always going to provoke contradictory responses between disunity and unity. It's always going to trigger, I think it's going to trigger a lot of people's most baseline instincts. If you're the kind of person who didn't like those other groups, it will make you not like them more. If you're the other kind of person who was like, no, in the end they're human too, it's going to make you even more sympathetic with them. With of course people sort of being on either end of the bell curve. So I think it will reinforce basic instincts and not drive new ones, so to speak.
What about you, Stephen? What's your vibe between sort of different Central Asian republics getting along?
To be honest, I have to completely agree with that. I think that from an individual level, it probably doesn't change things that weren't already there. There's already some underlying tensions throughout the region and whatever. But if it had started in one of the countries and spread to the others, of course, that might, prompt a different answer. But the fact that it sort of appears to be an outside threat that's coming in from elsewhere, I don't see on a person-to-person basis that it changes very much that wasn't already there. Governmentally, yeah, I mean, look, over the past couple of years, you've already had these problems with the Kazakh and Kyrgyz border being shut down during the last election and so on. And so it is peculiar to hear that Uzbek now is the partner that they're willing to pull supplies with, but also it's great to hear, right? I mean, that's the kind of news that you want to come out of the region. So I don't see that it changes much, but if anything, hopefully it does actually promote cooperation and promote closer relations between these countries.
So my last question, I'll stay on you, Steve. What is your prediction for, let's say, the next 6 months of this pandemic?
In Kyrgyzstan, you mean, or globally?
Let's say for the region.
Man, I mean, I'm sort of with Chris. I think on a best case scenario, you have a month and a half, 2 months to where things are largely shut down and there's not much travel and there's not much movement. And then as soon as they can, the countries are going to want to open back up and start encouraging trade and money and the free flow of people and goods. So I very dearly, as somebody that lives here and has friends here and just consider this home, I very dearly hope that that's what we see.
Cool. So to end off the interview, so where can we find you on social media, and are you plugging anything at the moment?
Yeah, so for me on Instagram and Twitter, I'm SLIOY, and if you search that on Facebook, my page will end up coming up too. Particularly the past few days when I haven't had a whole lot to do with my free time, I've been posting a lot of Instagram stories from here. So if you want to see what life is like inside here, that's definitely the place I can tell you to turn to.
What about you, Chris?
My Twitter, Schwartztronica. So it's my name plus Tronica. When I made it, I really liked electronica, and I thought it was a nice name, and now I regret it. SCHWARTZTRONICA. I also have been using my Facebook profile, maybe I don't know, unwisely, I don't know, as a bit of a hub to curate some news, because you have to request me on Twitter. Like I closed that account, and I'm not going to open it anytime soon because I've been assailed by bots and sock puppets since this crisis started. So I don't want them to have access to my account. But my Facebook is the same. It's the same username. So you can just type facebook.com and then Schwartztronica and you'll find me. Yeah, there you have it.
Awesome. Well, but gentlemen, both of you, stay safe. Stay with your families, and thank you so much for being on the Red Line. It's good to do this little bit of a fun, side piece to our usual episodes, but just getting to see what's happening with a coronavirus in a region we don't talk about a lot, but a region I find quite close to my heart, and I spend a bit of time in there myself. So thank you so much for coming on, and we'll talk soon.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
Yeah.
Take care.